Hello, I am Enrique Quesada, and this is Mexico Centered, a podcast from the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The levels of violence in Mexico continue to rise. While 2017 had a record number of homicides and became the most violent year to date, the same happened in 2018, and 2019 is continuing in this alarming trend. What are the contributors to this national security problem? Is President López Obrador's National Guard the right way to go? How is it different from previous efforts to tackle this issue? To answer these questions, I sat down with Alejandro Hope. Alejandro Hope is a security analyst and consulting partner at GEA, Group of Economists and Associates. Previously, he worked as Security Projects Director at the Mexican Institute for Competitiveness, known as IMCO, and from 2008 to 2011 held various management positions at the Centro de Investigación y Seguridad Nacional, CISEN. In addition, he is a columnist at El Universal. Here's our conversation. Alejandro Hope, thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be on the Mexico Center podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I'm excited to talk to you about the security problem in Mexico. You are kind of one of the top security analysts in the country. And so I want to talk about the strategy of the López Obrador administration. But before then, if you can give us a sense of where we're at and where this problem comes from. So 2017 was the most violent year, and then 2018 was the most violent year, and it seems like 2019 is also appearing to be the most violent year.
Well, yes, Mexico is facing a major crime wave. Didn't start last year. It started probably in 2015. The number of homicide victims per month has almost doubled in the past 4 years. It is not likely to end anytime soon. The most recent data we have is that homicides in the first quarter of 2019 were up 9.5% compared to the same period last year. At this rate, we'll end 2019 with over 37,000 homicide victims. That is more than twice the U.S. total. To put it in perspective. Wow. And homicide rate that is closely approaching 30 per 100,000, which is higher than Colombia, higher than Brazil, and approaching the levels of Central America. There are no simple explanations for this. Part of one of the causes is the rapid fragmentation of criminal groups. We're no longer facing large-scale, well-structured, well-organized, identifiable cartels, or at least not to the same extent as a decade ago. What we're facing is a large array of smaller gangs that tend to be more local in nature, more predatory in their activities, and less connected to international drug markets, and more devoted to exploiting local economies by means of extortion, by means of theft, by means of kidnapping. There are also a number of institutional changes that may be driving this. There not only did we have a transition at the national level, also a transition at the state level and local levels. So we knew there is a large array of new authorities all around the country, some of which were not very experienced, some of which might be facing difficulties getting the handle of their jobs. There are also changes in the international drug market that might be driving this. Heroin prices in Mexico are collapsing as a result of fentanyl. Fentanyl is replacing heroin in many U.S. markets. That has led to a collapse in the prices of opium gum and opium poppy in Mexico, and might be driving some of the gangs that were devoted to that specific illegal activity to other illegal activities. So that might also be a driver of violence. Whatever reason, the fact remains that we're still on an upward trend, and there is no end in sight to this crime wave.
So, is this a failure of past administrations, or is it the enormous challenges that the kind of rapid changing market poses?
Violence is a structural problem in Mexico. Mexico has been facing high homicide rates for quite a long time. Actually, we're at the same level that we were in the 60s. And throughout the 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s, we were over 15 to 20 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. We had something of a peaceful interlude between 1995 and 2007, more or less. But then homicides started spiking back. So this is not a new problem, and it is not driven necessarily by short-term policy. There is a failure of Mexican institutions to deal with this, and that is also a structural problem. Mexico has massively underinvested in the security and justice sector. Mexico spent about 0.8% of GDP security and justice, excluding defense spending. And Colombia, by means of contrast, Colombia spent about 2.2% of GDP. The U.S. spends about 1.5% of GDP. So Mexico underinvests, and it shows. And it's police forces, and it's prosecutors, and it's criminal justice system, and it's prisons. And that mismatch between the challenge and the response shows in the size of the challenge and the paucity of the response shows in really horrible crime statistics.
So these are kind of the places where you think they could, like, these institutions are the places where Mexico can invest and should invest to tackle the issue.
Yes, it should. There should be a sustained effort to improve institutions. It's not only about money, but it's also about money. There needs to be an increase in the budget allocated to this functions of government. But you also need to change the relationship between the different levels of government in Mexico. Public safety and crime fighting are a joint responsibility of all three levels of government, of the municipalities, states, and the federal government. But something that is the responsibility of everyone is the responsibility of no one. So that creates there is a number of institutional features in Mexican federalism that leads every political actor in the system to pass the buck to a different level of government. So everyone wants the federal government to take over, but the federal government doesn't have the resources. So the federal government starts complaining about the absence of effort from the state and local governments. So that there is this political dynamic is not conducive to a sustained response to this challenge.
So before moving on to discussing the strategies of the security strategy of the López Obrador administration, which is famous or infamous depending on one's point of view,
sure.
I want to talk a little bit about numbers, and especially the president's numbers. There was this case in one of the morning press conferences where Univision journalist Jorge Ramos asked a question about the number of homicides, and the president said, I have different numbers. And so there seems to be a mismatch between the numbers that the president has and the ones that even the government itself publishes.
Yeah. There are two sets of official numbers of homicides, as there are in many countries. One comes from the health system. Okay. They're produced. It is accounted with death certificates in a coroner reports, and that is compiled by Mexico's Statistics Board called INEGI. It is produced once a year. It is published once a year. Then you have a different set of numbers that come from an institution called the National Secretariat of the Public Safety System, of the National Public Safety System. That information comes from case files. Whenever there's a homicide, you open a case file and then you account for it, and that leads to two specific numbers: or the number of case files and the number of victims, because there might be more than one victim in any specific case file. That is published every month on a monthly basis, and although they are not the same, I mean, the numbers coming from the criminal justice system tends to be below the numbers coming from the health system. But trend-wise, they follow each other. However, under the current administration has started producing a third data series on homicides. They publish it daily, and they compile those numbers from reports from federal agencies that are on the ground, from the Army, the Navy, the Federal Police, the Civilian Intelligence Agency, etc., etc. Those numbers tend to be of a lesser quality than the numbers that are collected by the official institutions. Why so? Because they don't have the capability to monitor every single homicide in the country every single day. Because those numbers change every day, because something that might be labeled a manslaughter on day one might become a first degree homicide by day 3. Something that is labeled a homicide might then, after further investigation, might be classified as suicide or as an accident. So numbers tend to change. So you need some time to consolidate the numbers. Those numbers that are produced by the president tends to, over the past 4 months, have been about 20% below the numbers produced by the Executive Secretariat. So it is an underestimate of about 20 to 25%. And we don't know whether in terms of trend, whether it will follow the other data series, because it's very new.
Right.
My guess is that the government is looking for good news whenever it can. They're clutching at straws for anything that might be labeled a decline or a good news. I mean, it's not necessarily a problem that they have their own numbers. Problem is that when they combine those numbers with the numbers, or try to contrast those numbers with numbers coming from official institutions, from a completely different data series that is produced with a completely different methodology.
Right.
And that can create a lot of confusion. There's already a lot of confusion about homicide numbers in Mexico. This additional series has only heightened that confusion.
Yeah. Well, so now to talk about the strategies, and especially the National Guard. So before the election, the Peña administration passed this law called the Interior Security Law, right, to regulate the use of the armed forces for security, for public security purposes. And so various NGOs and politicians in the opposition warn about the dangers of the militarization of the country. Right? And then after the election, the transition team of the López Obrador administration talks about creating this new body, the National Guard, and there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of talk whether it's going to be under civilian command or military command. And the president seems to favor the use of the military.
Sure.
I wonder whether there's a lot of change then between previous administrations and this administration, or it's more about creating an institution to, if it works, have full credit for it.
Well, I mean, it follows a trend of an increasing use of the armed forces for civilian purposes, and particularly for public safety and crime fighting. That didn't start under this administration. It didn't even start under the Calderon administration. I mean, if you look at the history of counter narcotics in Mexico, they were using the army for eradication purposes in the 1940s. They were launching major counter-narcotics offensives using the army in the 1970s. So this is not new, and it is a sign of the weakness of civilian police institutions in Mexico. every single administration for the past 25 years at least has had the temptation, has tried to use the military in growing ways to try to fill the gap that is left by the absence of competent police forces. So it is part of a broad historical trend. It is new in some ways, this National Guard. First and foremost, it changes the equilibrium between the military and the civilian policymakers in interesting and possibly disturbing ways. I mean, as you said, there was a lot of back and forth in Congress about the specific language to of the constitutional reform that created the National Guard. They yielded on a specific issue, that is that this National Guard will not be located administratively within the Ministry of Defense, but it will be located administratively in the Ministry of Security, which is a civilian institution. But it did allow, I mean, in the last minute change to the bill, allowed the president to name whoever he wants to head the National Guard. It eliminated a prohibition that had been negotiated during this process for military officers, for on-duty military officers to head the National Guard and to belong to the National Guard. So the fact remains that even if this is located administratively within a civilian institution, the military will control it. Will control it because they will provide the troops, because they will provide the leadership, because they will provide the facilities, because they will provide the equipment, because they will provide the doctrine. I mean, this National Guardsmen will be trained by the armed forces. So it is what was thought as a stopgap, what had been defined as stopgap of using the military for law enforcement purposes, during the process of building up police capabilities, has now become a permanent feature.
So in previous strategies, the armed forces were used basically as a complement while you build the civilian force.
This was something of a stopgap. We don't have sufficient police forces, so let's use the military while we build. So López Obrador said, no, we're going to use the military for good from here on now, and that changes the status quo in interesting ways.
Yeah.
So it is the same, but it's
right.
Has some interesting differences.
So I wonder about your position in this. So during the 2018 electoral process, you were announced as part of the team in Margarita Zaval's campaign. And so you must then have your own way of looking at the problem and the solution, and perhaps your preferences for what. And if I'm not mistaken, it was for the use of federal police, or basically continuing that trend, right?
Yes. I mean, at the end of the day, what you need, the problem needs to be tackled at the local and state levels. Whatever you do at the federal level will never be enough. What we were proposing during the campaign, I mean, and my presence in the campaign was a short one, was to continue to build up a federal police, but I mean for very specific tasks, not to supplant, not state and local law enforcement agencies, but to tackle some specific law enforcement challenges, to go after organized crime, to secure critical infrastructure, to guarantee freedom of transit and in Mexico's roads, things of that nature. Something relatively broad challenges. But for law enforcement, at the local level, which is what drives perceptions of Mexico. I mean, to tackle homicide, to tackle extortion, to tackle kidnapping, to tackle theft, burglaries, so on and so forth, you need stronger local and state level police forces. So what we were proposing is create something that we called a national police system, which in broad terms meant the following. It meant centralizing some administrative functions of the police while maintaining local operational control over law enforcement. What administrative process were we thinking of? Recruitment, for instance, have centralized recruitment of police officers, training, even the payroll to some extent, promotions, professional standards, even benefits, say Social Security benefits for police officers, and that would allow all police forces to homogenize over the medium term. So they would mean the same to be a police officer in Chiapas as in Tamaulipas, and you could make a career out of being a police officer, and starting as a traffic cop somewhere in the boondocks, and you could aspire to become the head of the federal police, and that it was just this national police corps that would provide police officers, but operational control would be left at the state and local levels. It makes no sense to try to micromanage where a traffic cop should sit in say Tijuana from Mexico City. It makes no sense to micromanage what type of tactics should a police chief adopt in Ciudad Juarez. Those kinds of decisions should be taken at the local level, and you could have accountability at the local level. But the process of building up this police force would be a national one. That was what we were proposing, and that would have allowed us over the medium term to reduce military presence in law enforcement. Basically, we estimated that we need about 40,000 more federal police officers to not be dependent on the military for providing law enforcement services in throughout the country, and that would have cost about upwards of about $1 billion additional $1 billion in additional budget for the federal police to get to that level. So it was we thought it was feasible, and we thought that would have made much more sense than to start, and then what this is doing, what they're proposing, or what they're going to do, which is to start from scratch,
right,
with a security body that doesn't have any institutional structure whatsoever. That you need to start. You're going to destroy the federal police, which is something that we have been building for the past 20 years, and you're going to start from zero.
Right.
So it will, and it is not tackling the state and local dimensions of the problem, and actually might make things worse by creating disincentives for state and local governments to build their own capabilities. Last week, President López Obrador said, quite rightly, that everyone wants the National Guard. Of course, everyone wants the National Guard because it's easier to call
right
for outside intervention than to build up your own capabilities.
So, I assume that you still have this belief that this is the right way to address the problem, at least where Mexico is at now,
Sure.
and that it seems that the strategy of the López Obrador administration is maybe the polar opposite of that.
To some extent, it is extremely centralizing. I think the key feature of this strategy is extremely centralizing. The president wants to put National Guardsmen throughout the country, but the paradox of this is it will never be enough. I mean, at best, even if they find ways to tackle very complicated administrative issues and political issues, they will get a National Guard that is somewhere between 130 and 150,000 men strong. This country needs about 500,000 cops. So it is simply not enough. And to the extent that this creates this incentive for building up capabilities at the local and at the local and state levels, we might end up at a worse place than we are right now, with fewer competent police officers than we have now.
So to end, and no pun intended, I wanted to see what's your hope, what you hope to see, and in the security strategy, maybe some changes, maybe you think maybe the following administration.
My guess is that at some point in time, they will find out that it is not enough. It is simply unfeasible to try to micromanage security from the national powers. That security is built from the ground up. That you need the cooperation of local and state governments. That you need to create political incentives for that type of cooperation. And even if they continue with the build-up of this National Guard, they will supplement that with two things I think are crucial. One is a reform of state and local police forces, and secondly, enhancing capabilities of prosecutors. The weakest link in the Mexican criminal justice system are prosecutors. Their capability to build up complex cases is very limited. The capability to try to find the evidence to say try a murder or a drug kingpin or something of that nature is limited. So we should be investing much more in that. Hopefully they will find out that is the case.
Well, Alejandro Hope, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure.
That was Alejandro Hope. That is it for this episode. Thank you for listening to Mexico Centered. Thanks to Lisa Wakata, our program manager, and to Tony Payan, the director of the Mexico Center at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can visit our website at bakerinstitute.org/Mexico, where you can find our latest publications. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the guests and the host, and do not necessarily reflect those of the Mexico Center. If you have any comments or suggestions, you can email us at mexicocenter@rice.edu. We would love to hear from you. Mexico Centered is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can subscribe through your favorite podcast app to receive all of our new episodes directly on your phone. I am Enrique Quesada. I will see you next time.